talk about Christian YouTube influencers and discernment because it's a whole new world for the church. Now, as Exhibit A, let's talk specifically about Alan Parr of The Beat. He's one of the largest Christian YouTubers, and his latest warning about the ministry of Mike Todd, who's pastor of Transformation Church, an even larger Christian YouTuber. Now, if you're not familiar with either one of these guys, you can apply what we're going to talk about to teachers and preachers you do listen to, including me. The main objective is to give some helpful principles around discernment. Now, full disclosure, the topic of discernment and calling out preachers and teachers is a subject I'm a little twitchy about in both directions. What I mean by that is this. In one direction, one of the most traumatic and destructive experiences I ever went through very early in my ministry was where one famous pastor wrote a book criticizing the ministry and approach of other famous pastors who had helped me a lot. Now, this happened during one of the most beautiful times of my Christian growth when I was in relationships that I was a part of. There was a small group we had started a Bible study, and we were into it, and it was transforming us. We led others to Christ. We gave to one another. We decided to start a ministry together. Then this book came along, and it landed like a hand grenade right in the middle of the living room. People took sides about what the book was addressing, and I watched good friends become enemies. It was horrific. It really was. If you've ever been through that kind of division, there are few things in life which are worse. So to add insult to injury, when I did an in-depth research on the book that was causing so many problems, I concluded that a stack of evidence showed that this author was at best irresponsible and at worst flat out wrong and destructive. Keep this in mind. Unity is a good thing. Division is a terrible thing, especially if you experience it up close and personal. I think that's why Paul coaches Titus this way. As for a person who stirs up division, after warning him once and then twice, have nothing more to do with him, knowing that such a person is warped and sinful. He is self-condemned. Now that's one direction. In the other direction, does that mean that it's wrong to do takedowns of people teaching wrong things? Well, of course not. But I learned you had better do your homework and you had better have integrity, right motives, and an absolute commitment to the truth. And when I say the truth, I'm not just talking about the truth of the Bible as you interpret it, but the truth of the situation and the people that you're talking about. Now, before we look at what Alan Parr has to say about Mike Todd, let me give you two absolutely critical elements that must be present for right discernment. They are objectivity and charity. Objectivity and charity. Now, objectivity is pursuing the truth based on the evidence, not my preferences, not my emotions. See, the Bible, when describing true justice, it says you're not supposed to show favoritism, whether to the rich or to the poor. The pursuit of the truth is the pursuit of what is real, no matter what the people are like you're dealing with. See, just because I like someone doesn't mean they can't be guilty, and just because I like someone doesn't make them right if they choose to be critical of someone else. I see this sometimes. You see, there are preachers out there that go after people, and we're used to them going after people. And sometimes we become a fan of theirs, and then they'll attack someone, and we'll automatically assume that that preacher was right to go on the attack. Well, not necessarily. Each case needs to be taken on its own merits. So that's objectivity. What about charity? Charity is about giving people the benefit of believing the best about them before assuming the worst. It's basically the same as innocent until proven guilty. It's the practical application of do to others as you would have them do to you. If someone thought I was in the wrong, I'd want them to give me the benefit of their belief that maybe I was either mistaken or they were mistaken before evidence proved otherwise. And that's what charity is. So when it comes to Mike Todd, I come into this with really very limited exposure to him. I've heard two full messages. Now, both were beneficial and good to me, and I liked the guy. I've had a positive but limited image of him from a distance, right? So on Alan Parr, I've only recently become exposed to him because of our new intentional focus on YouTube here at One Life Network. And before I listened to his talk about Mike Todd, honestly, I wasn't against him, but I wasn't a huge fan, and I think it was just merely stylistic, but I also heard him make a crack about speaking in tongues that I didn't agree with either. But through this journey of checking out what he had to say about Mike Todd, my levels of respect actually went up for Alan Parr. Now, that doesn't mean I agree with everything he said about Mike Todd, but I'm a lot more open. So here's how Alan Parr's video breaks down. He says he was inspired to make the video at all because of an Instagram post Mike Todd put up, and the fact that 1 million people seem to like it. So that's fair enough. So then he gives a very helpful way to sort between all the different preachers and teachers that you hear? Because we hear a lot of voices these days. How do we file those that are good and not so good? And that's kind of the thing that Alan Parr is good at. And I think it's the reason he's viewed by so many people. He's well organized, he's clear, and he breaks down difficult topics. He says there are teachers and preachers that fall in three categories. Number one, those that are recommended, those that you would tell people, yeah, you should listen to them. Two, there are those who are the opposite. They're false teachers, they're heretics, stay away from them. But number three, he says, there are those who aren't necessarily full-on heretics, but they are not recommended. And that's where he places Mike Todd. And spoiler alert, I think Parr partly makes a fair case, not a slam dunk one when it comes to putting Mike Todd in this category. He divides Mike Todd's problems into four categories. Now, I think he should have concentrated on one or two at the most. Now, the reason I say that is because he says he was inspired to make the video at all because of Todd's Instagram post. He deals with that, but I think because it was his main motivation, he should have dealt with it more in depth. He spends as much or more time on one point, which for me was pretty weak tea. He said Mike Todd was guilty of sensuality. That's where he begins. Now here's where objectivity and charity can help us get our bearings. He gives a few examples. The first one is a point well taken. So apparently during a sermon, Mike Todd has what seems to be a fairly revealing picture of his wife on his shirt. Parr blurs it out on his channel, so I don't know how suggestive it was, but I'd agree, based on what little I know, that this maybe qualifies as sensual, but it sure qualifies as weird. Okay, I get that. But the point gets weakened by the other examples of sensuality. Apparently, Michael Todd has several pictures on his social media where him and his wife are in their swimsuits. He doesn't have a shirt on and all that. And because he's done this, Parr concludes that Todd lacks accountability. And when you look at it, Parr himself acknowledges it's them on vacation, obviously on the beach. Well, most of us have been to the beach. Unless you're a Muslim, where women literally wear robes into the water, most bathing suits are fairly revealing, some more than others. So is it wrong to post a picture of something that we've all seen when we've gone to the beach on vacation or worn on the beach? Well, Parr seems to imply that the posting of this picture is the wrong part. But this seems pretty wildly subjective to be calling someone out publicly over. And here's where objectivity and charity are critical. Parr isn't just critical of Todd's wife being shown in her bathing suit, he's critical of Todd having a picture with his shirt off. This was presented as evidence of Todd being guilty of sensuality. But when you look at the series of photos, you can see this on Parr's presentation of it, all the pictures are dated. It's him showing how he lost weight over time. I think very few of us would find any of that sensual. Now, do I think the picture thing is a little overdone and should be dialed back? Well, sure. Do I think it's evidence that Mike Todd lacks accountability or is driven by sensuality? I just don't see the evidence. Goes on to tag Todd off based on his showing a video of his wife putting some kind of ointment, in Parr's words, on him. And I think the ointment is like sunscreen. So, and Todd in the picture hashtags the picture, marriage is awesome. So showing your wife applying sunscreen to you makes you guilty of sensuality? So much you deserve a public rebuke? Color me skeptical. Being charitable to Mike Todd, my suspicion, based on what I've seen, is that he and his wife are intentionally presenting God's design of marriage as a good and desirable way to live, which is a message that's needed because we have an entire younger generation coming up thinking the exact opposite. Let's face it, you can make a strong case that the Bible itself includes sensual talk, but that's for another time. I think the most we can say is Mike Todd would do good to exercise some caution around these issues, maybe rethink some things, but I think it's at best a diversion from the very topic that Parr said inspired him to do the video to begin with. And that's Parr's category 2. Here's what Mike Todd posted on Instagram that got like 1 million upvotes. He said this: "Be careful about what you speak into the atmosphere. Your words are creating your world." Now, I think Parr should have spent his time doing a deep dive into this statement, especially since he said it was the reason he did the post. Now, this statement deserves the deep dive instead of what amounts to kind of a slap-down approach to it anyway that he ends up taking. Now, if we apply the principles of objectivity and clarity, where does that land us? First, objectively, biblically, it should have us asking, is what he's saying true? Well, thinking charitably, it depends on what he meant by it. Charity, remember, is about assuming the best first. So, see, our words are not creating our reality in the sense of bringing things into being, literally, like a new car or a job or something like that. But the Bible does talk about how our words shape and influence our life more than we realize, from our relationships to our perceptions about God and others and ourselves. Now, neuroscience has backed this up. Words do shape things. The book of Proverbs is filled with cautions and admonitions about the use of words. Is that what Todd means? Well, it's at least possible. Or does he mean what Parr accuses him of? A direct ripoff of the New Age movement called manifesting, which is the idea that your words work like magic and they form new realities in sort of this hocus pocus sense. And those two ideas are very different. Now, I think Todd should listen to Parr and intentionally differentiate himself from those who do manifesting for the sake of people who follow him. There was 1 million likes on this thing after all. Being such a great communicator, he would be great at helping people understand the difference between those two things. And I think that's important. But the $1 million question is, what did Todd actually mean? Now, if it's a positive confession manifesting bit, well, he needs to take the L. If not, he could stand to clarify. But Parr goes on to apply this to the larger question of prosperity. And this is where I think Mike Todd deserves to be pushed a little bit. The reason is because this is not just a poorly worded Instagram post or an unfortunate wording during a sermon, and we've all been guilty of that, but because it's a formally stated theological commitment of their church. You can read it on their website. See, when it comes to learning discernment, one of the most helpful things I ever learned was how the early church, meaning from around the 1st century to about the 4th or 5th century, how they handled heresy and how they defined it and how they differentiated between making mistakes, having weird ideas, or actual false teachings. And it really helped me. So, as we all know, there's core doctrine to the faith that's formally articulated in the creeds. The reality of the Trinity, the atonement, the resurrection, the second coming, all those kinds of things. Now, if you were centered and responsible around those issues, you were considered orthodox in those days. Now, if you colored outside those lines, they would pull you aside and give you a chance to adjust yourself. They had an authority structure where you could do that kind of thing. Well, it's important to note, they would not take someone down for being mistaken or having ideas that were different on non-essential creedal doctrines. They would only take them down if they violated something that was considered established doctrine by the church as a whole, and a leader, get this, and they formed a movement around their error. And this could be the case with his church's statement about prosperity. They say literally in their doctrinal statement, under the category labeled health and prosperity, we believe that as a part of Christ's work of salvation, it is the Father's will for believers to become whole, healthy, and successful in all areas of life. And then they name those areas of life: spiritual, mental and emotional, physical, and financial. Now, this is where I think there's legitimate concerns that should be addressed. Now, their doctrinal statement up until this one is as orthodox as any biblical church. But here they're making a pretty significant claim that you could argue sets them up to be a part of a larger movement. Everybody believes that God blesses people financially or that God heals people. But what they're claiming is that these things are a part of the atoning work that Jesus did on the cross. And if that's true, what does it even mean to be financially successful? Paul says that we should be content if we have food and clothing. Is that what he means? And this goes on and on and on. You can't make a very good case from the New Testament that God is all about financial prosperity for people. See, in the early church, they had the authority structure to agree to pull someone aside, show them their error, and lovingly call them to correction. They were very passionate about keeping unity. Now, we don't have that same infrastructure, but I do think the same basic concept should happen here. Objectively, and even charitably, I think there's a problem here, and I hope Mike Todd corrects it. Hope that helps. See you next time. Be sure to hit the subscribe button.